There is a Japanese text written in the early 1700s in which we read the following observation, which sounds like a warning. It is bad when one thing becomes two. Tonight, as I introduce Professor of Religion at Princeton University, Jacqueline Stone, before her delivery of our Rohrbach lecture, these brief remarks must risk this particular danger. The peril lurks in the sheer impossibility in so short a time of as fully expressing the magnitude of Professor Stone's towering academic achievement and that of our miles-deep gratitude for her and her husband's visit to St. John's College here at our beloved Santa Fe campus. While at the same time, in addition of conveying the importance of the Rohrbach lecture series, of which tonight's is the 11th, the importance to our students, to the St. John's community more broadly, and I dare say, to the city of Santa Fe itself. Having confessed in advance that no amount of thanks will be quite adequate, let me begin all the same by thanking the Rohrbach family for making this evening, and so many evenings like it, possible. And to those family members of that illustrious family present here tonight, Miss Louise Height and Miss Elizabeth Rohrbach, I wanted not only to thank them, but to say a brief word about why I think this lecture series is so crucial. I, as it happens, did my doctoral work at Princeton University, where I had the pleasure of meeting Miss Stone, Professor Stone, excuse me. And my focus was on modern Japanese literature. And because the great privilege of teaching at St. John's College means focusing primarily on texts of the Western tradition, the Rohrbach lecture is especially important to me and to us because it offers a rare and prolonged moment for us to consider attentively the traditions of our neighbors in the East. And this opportunity has made the world itself seem, in the best possible way, smaller, while also reminding us year after year of that same world's impossible vastness and richness. On behalf, then, of every one of us here, I thank you and your family for these gifts. And speaking of making the world a smaller and vaster place, I also wanted to acknowledge the attendance here this evening of Miss Elizabeth Rohrbach's book club, who my spies tell me are currently reading The Tale of Genji, a book we know that simply does not end, even and especially after you finish reading it. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages later, God help you. Right? And finally, I would like to thank Professor Stone again for her visit. For our most recent initiates, let me say that Professor Stone is Professor Emerita in the Religion Department of Princeton University, where she taught Buddhism and Japanese religions. Her published work includes Original Enlightenment and the Transformation of Medieval Japanese Buddhism, and Right Thoughts at the Last Moment, Buddhist Deathbed Practices in Medieval Japan. Currently, she heads the Kuroda Institute for the Study of Buddhism, and I don't mind adding, a considerable amount of my time in graduate school was spent hearing and later habitually seeking out information about Professor Stone's famously illuminating classes. More than once did I wish at such times that I were a student instead of religion, rather than of literature. The title of her lecture tonight is Right Thoughts at the Last Moment, Buddhism and Deathbed Practices in Medieval Japan. Please help me to welcome to the podium Professor Jacqueline Stone.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor Ron Wilson, for that far too generous introduction. All my academic life, I've heard about St. John's College, and I am thrilled to visit. And it's an especial honor to give the 11th annual Rohrbach lecture. I'd like to thank Ron for initiating the invitation. We did know each other, as he mentioned, when he was a graduate student at Princeton. I'd also like to thank Guillermo Bleichmar for his help and advice in preparing, Veronica Tucker for making the arrangements, and all of you for making time on your Friday evening. Modern teachers of Buddhism often stress the importance of being present to this moment, living fully in the here and now. But historically, wherever it has spread, Buddhism has also provided teachings and rituals for coping with death, both one's own death and that of others. Death is, in fact, a central concern in Buddhism. Doctrinally speaking, it exemplifies samsara, the round of deluded birth and death, or in broader terms, the suffering that we unenlightened persons must repeat until liberation is achieved. This is illustrated by the famous Wheel of Rebirth. Here we have a Tibetan example. All 6 of the deluded rebirth realms in the traditional Buddhist cosmology, those of, let's see, we've got hell dwellers, can't see too well, hell dwellers, hungry ghosts, animals, asura demons, humans, and heavenly beings, gods. And they are all held fast in the grip of Yama, the Lord of Death, represented here as a terrifying being holding the world tooth and claw, and you can see his headdress of skulls. At the same time, death is sometimes represented in Buddhist literature as a messenger who awakens one to the impermanence of all things and arouses religious aspiration. We find this in the Buddha's own life story. When he was still a young prince, the sight of a corpse being carried along in a funeral procession helped prompt him to renounce the world and seek the way. And in Buddhist hagiographies, stories of holy persons, as a sign of their liberation, the death of eminent monks and other spiritually accomplished persons is invariably depicted as serene. Again, the Buddha himself sets the example, as he is said to have passed away in a meditative state. And you can see in the Buddha there in the center is very peaceful, meditating, while his disciples and followers around him are racked by grief, sobbing in anguish. From an emic or insider perspective, enlightened individuals do not undergo death at all, in the sense of death as a revolving door that spins one back into yet another deluded rebirth. Their exit from the world is spoken of in different terms. They are said to enter final nirvana or to go to a pure land. Their mastery of death, so to speak, becomes a proof of their liberation. From an etic or outsider perspective, broadly speaking, we could say that Buddhism provides 3 major logics or strategies for coping with death. First, we have a logic of personal effort and accountability, in which present acts shape future consequences, and individuals reap the effects of their prior deeds. This is the law of karmic causality. And from this standpoint, all the actions of a lifetime are a form of death preparation, in that the merit of accumulated good deeds will help one at the time of death and in the life to come. Second is a funerary logic, by which the living can intervene, so to speak, and ritually transfer the merit of their own good deeds to benefit the deceased. Merit, in a Buddhist sense, is the force resulting from compassionate actions that will bring about positive future results. Throughout Asia, the providing of funerary and memorial rites based on this logic of merit transference has formed one of Buddhism's chief social roles and a basis of relations between monastics and lay devotees. So these two are both relevant to tonight's talk, but I'll be focusing on the third, practice for the very time of death, at the last moment, informed by an ideal that is known as right thoughts at the last moment, or dying mindfully. Ancient Indian religions, not just Buddhism, but Indian religions, shared the premise that one's last thought, one's last mental image, exerts an influence far beyond the ordinary acts of daily life and decisively shapes one's next rebirth. Suppose if, at the moment of death, one were able to focus one's mind on the thought, may I be reborn a king, or may I be reborn a god in the heavens, then it was believed one might indeed be reborn so, in accordance with one's wish. In the case of Buddhism, it was thought that by focusing one's thoughts on the Buddha in one's last moments, one might achieve not only a better rebirth, but perhaps even nirvana, final liberation itself. With the rise of the Buddhist movement, known as the Mahayana, or Great Vehicle, understandings of the goal of Buddhist practice were reframed, less in terms of putting an end to birth and death than of mastering the wisdom and compassion of a bodhisattva, an enlightened being who remains voluntarily in the realms of rebirth to guide others. Accordingly, this goal of right thoughts at the last moment came to be associated with aspirations for birth in a pure land, or ojo in Japanese, that is, going to a world presided over by a Buddha or a perfected bodhisattva. The Mahayana imagination filled the cosmos with Buddha lands in the 10 directions, and many practitioners aspired to be reborn in such a realm. Popular postmortem destinations included the Tushta heaven, the heaven of satisfaction where the future Buddha Maitreya dwells, or Mount Potalaca, home of the Bodhisattva Kannon. Overwhelmingly, however, aspirations were directed toward the pure land of utmost bliss, said to lie far away in the western quarter of the cosmos, presided over by the Buddha Amitabha. I'm going to call him by the Japanese version of his name, Amida. Birth in Amida's realm represented a shortcut on the long path of bodhisattva practice leading to perfect awakening, because there, conditions for progress on the path were said to be ideal, and one could receive the Buddha Amida's direct instruction. East Asian Buddhists maintained that once born in Amida's world, one would not again fall back into the deluded realms, and one's eventual attainment of Buddhahood would be assured. At the same time, people believed that in Amida's land, they could be reunited with their deceased relatives, friends, and teachers. While not part of formal doctrine, this promise of reunion with deceased loved ones has proved compelling wherever Buddhist Pure Land teachings have spread. The ideal of mindful death became linked to birth in Amida's Pure Land in the Visualization Sutra, an important scripture in the tradition of Pure Land Buddhist thought, especially in a passage addressing the ojo, the birth in the Pure Land, of ignorant and sinful persons. It says that even the worst evildoer, guilty of the 10 evils and 5 perverse offenses, should he meet a good teacher who instructs him so that he can sustain 10 consecutive thoughts of Amida in his last moments while chanting Amida's name, that person will thereby erase the sins of 8 billion eons and be born in the Pure Land. Throughout the Buddhist world, specific rituals developed to help people focus their thoughts on the Buddha at the time of death. Sources for Buddhist deathbed practice are especially rich for Premodern Japan, which is my own area of research focus. My talk will focus on the late 10th through 14th centuries, when protocols for deathbed practice first took shape and spread. On the 23rd day of the 5th month, in the year 986, a group of monks, calling themselves the Samadhi Society of 25, or Niju Gozanmaye, met at the Yokawa retreat on Mount Hiei, the great Buddhist center of the Tendai school northeast of the capital in what is today's Kyoto, and they signed an oath. In it, they pledged that if any of them fell seriously ill, the others would hurry to his side and help him to practice right contemplation at the hour of death, so that he might directly achieve birth in Amida's Pure Land. They further pledged that whether by the power of his own vows or by relying on the power of the Buddha, any of them who died should contrive to inform the others, through a dream or in a waking vision, whether he had achieved the Pure Land or fallen into the evil paths. The year before, the scholar monk Genshin, who would later join this group, had authored an influential work called Essentials of Birth in the Pure Land, Ojo Yoshu, which included the first set of instructions for deathbed practice to be compiled in Japan. These end-of-life protocols were adopted by the society, and they soon spread beyond the monastic world and inspired several later, more elaborate sets of instructions for deathbed practice. Genshin's instructions were largely based on Chinese precedents, with some additions of his own, and were chiefly aimed at monks. A dying monk should be moved to a separate hall or room at the monastery called the Hall of Impermanence, so that the sight of his own familiar room and possessions would not arouse worldly attachments. There in the Hall of Impermanence, he should be placed before a Buddha image and made to face west toward the Pure Land. He should hold one end of a cord woven from 5 colored threads and tie it at its other end to the hand of the Buddha image, by which to be drawn up, as it were, into the Pure Land. The dying monk and those attending him should chant the Nembutsu, or the name of Amida, usually repeated in the formula Namu Amida Butsu, meaning praise be to Amida Buddha, or I take refuge in the Buddha Amida. Relatives and other visitors who have recently consumed meat, alcohol, or the 5 pungent roots should be denied access, lest they disturb the dying person's contemplation. Those close to him should encourage him to shun this defiled world and aspire to the Pure Land. They should exhort him to focus his mind on the Buddha and to visualize Amida's physical marks, his radiant light, and his descent together with his holy retinue to welcome the dying and escort them to his Pure Land. If the dying person sees visions of the Buddha, he should, if physically able, describe them, and those attending him should write them down. Or, if he sees ominous visions, such as flames, all present should redouble their efforts in chanting until those visions are dissipated. Genshin's instructions became the model for subsequent manuals of deathbed practice and also helped popularize notions of Amida's welcoming descent to meet the dying. This is called Raigo in Japanese. And parenthetically, within 100 years of his death, Genshin was being retrospectively credited with having initiated a new genre of religious painting, depicting Amida's coming to receive the dying. These Japanese Raigo paintings, as they're called, reached a height of development in the 13th and 14th centuries. Let me show you some examples. So here, we see Amida descending on colored clouds with his holy entourage of bodhisattvas and celestial musicians. And the bodhisattva Kannon here carries the lotus pedestal on which the dying person will ride to and be born in the Pure Land. Here's another example. Amida is descending here to meet a dying monk waiting within a hut set deep in the mountains. And you can see this monk is sitting before a low table on which are arranged scrolls of Buddhist teachings. Here's a close-up. Again, Kannon is offering the lotus pedestal to this dying monk. Some surviving Raigo paintings were actually used in the deathbed context. This large folding screen retains vestiges of the cords attached at the hands right here for the dying person to hold. Let's also look at a couple of deathbed scenes. In this 19th century woodblock print, we see a dying monk, and he lies before a Buddha image, holding a cord attached to its hand. And here there are two attendant monks who are chanting with him, and a third is striking a bell to keep the pitch, to keep the rhythm of the chanting. In a 14th century scroll, somewhat earlier, we see depicted the death of an ascetic called Shinjaku, who has built for himself a temporary enclosure to use as a hall of impermanence, or death chamber, as he's enshrined this hanging picture of the Buddha Amida, and you can see the rays of Amida's light coming to meet him. Notice the people surrounding him. Witnessing the death of someone thought certain to be born in the Pure Land was believed to generate auspicious karmic ties conducive to one's own ojo. And for that reason, Shinjaku has allowed his lay supporters to be present. And you can also see somebody peering in from behind the screen back here. Like earlier Buddhist teachers on the Asian continent, Genshin had stressed that deathbed contemplation has a power far exceeding the good deeds and religious practices performed at ordinary times. I've already mentioned how the Visualization Sutra asserts that even the most ignorant and evil persons, if they can concentrate on the Buddha Amida and invoke his name 10 times at the point of their death, can eradicate their past sins and be born in the Pure Land. The moment of death could thus be seen as a critical juncture where a lifetime of delusion and sinfulness could potentially be reversed, and an evil person could achieve ojo. However, the converse was also held to be true. Precisely because the last thought was deemed to be so powerful, no matter how much merit a person might have accumulated through devout practice in this life, one who did not achieve right mindfulness at the end, but gave way to delusive thoughts, would immediately fall into the evil realms. Thus, the last moment, the moment of death, embodied not only the ultimate opportunity for salvation, but also grave danger and uncertainty. Notions of the ambivalent potential of life's last moment were instrumental in shaping death preparations, and I'll return to that topic shortly. First, however, let me say a bit more about the ideal of dying mindfully. An invaluable source for studying this subject is the literary genre known as Ojo Den, literally biographies of Ojo Nin, or persons believed to have achieved birth in the Pure Land, Ojo. The first of these, titled Japanese Records of Birth in the Land of Utmost Bliss, or Nihon Ojo Gokuraki, was compiled around 985 by the poet and scholar Yoshishige no Yasutane, who had been inspired by Chinese precedents. More than a dozen subsequent collections were compiled from the 12th through 13th centuries. Ojo-den include examples of monks, laymen, nuns, and laywomen across social classes. The stated purpose of this literature, both for compilers and readers, was to form karmic ties conducing to one's own birth in the Pure Land by gathering and reading stories of those believed to have achieved this goal. In these accounts, the lives of their subjects are often summed up in just a few sentences, as though mere headnotes to their deaths, which are often described in considerable detail. Ojo-den, in fact, served to disseminate images of what a death with right thoughts looked like. The ideal death, as represented in these accounts, never takes one by surprise. The person concerned foresees it to the day and hour and announces it to disciples or family. He or she bathes and puts on clean clothes, then sits upright in the posture of meditation or lies down facing the west. Ojo-nin die peacefully, as though sinking into contemplation or falling asleep. Though their representations of serene deaths may be considerably idealized, these accounts tell us much about the actual forms of deathbed practice. Some persons are described as entering meditation in their last hours, but for most, deathbed practice entails some form of vocalization. Some chanted mantras or dharanis, that is, Buddhist spells or incantations, held to encapsulate extraordinary powers, such as the mantra of light, or the spell of the glory of the Buddha's crown, or passages from Buddhist scriptures, or the names of various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Most widely attested at all social levels was the Nembutsu, the chanting of Amida's name. Being simple, it was well suited to the deathbed situation, where the practitioner was often greatly weakened, mentally disoriented, or in pain. Chanting was accompanied by other ritual acts. Many dying persons held the 5 colored cords tied to the hand of a Buddha image. Afterwards, these cords might be cut up and divided among the deceased person's associates as a way of sharing karmic connections with the Pure Land. Some practitioners are described as forming mudras or ritualized symbolic hand gestures on their deathbed, or holding ritual implements such as an incense burner, or in some cases a written vow to be born in the Pure Land, or a record of the good deeds they had performed in this lifetime. How could one know whether somebody had really achieved birth in the Pure Land or not? A dying person's inward state was inaccessible to observers, and right thoughts at the last moment soon came to be understood in terms of outward conformity to proper ritual behavior, which was assumed to reflect right mindfulness. Dying calmly with the name of Amida on one's lips was itself deemed proof of Ojo. However, further evidence was sought, and 3 kinds of indicators are repeatedly mentioned. First, are wondrous signs appearing at the time of death or shortly thereafter. Mysterious fragrance or radiant light in the death chamber. Music of unearthly beauty, seemingly without source, heard in the air, or purple clouds rising in the west, were staples of Chinese and Korean Buddhist hagiographical literature and also pervade Japanese Ojo-den. Sometimes these signs are described as perceptible only to the dying person, but in other cases they are depicted as objectively evident to bystanders or even unrelated persons at a distance. One account tells us that when a woman of Omi province was chanting her final nembutsu, 8 persons heard music coming from the west, and 2 saw light and purple clouds rising above her roof. Another account relates that when the nobleman Shimotsuke no Atsuse called on the Buddha in his last moments, a ray of light suddenly struck his chest. Amazed, his attendants rushed outside, but the day was heavily clouded. After his death, the robe he wore was found to have turned gold just where the light had struck. A second class of indicators involved the condition of the corpse. Numerous accounts tell of practitioners whose bodies do not exhibit rigor mortis, but remain light and pliable. Even in the crematory fires, their bodies retain the posture of meditation. The monk Nensai, for example, dies sitting up, facing west, and holding an incense burner. His body maintains this position for 3 days, looking as though alive, and emits a wondrous fragrance. The body of the wife of the courtier Takashina no Atsuto does not rot, even though she dies at the height of summer, but exudes sweet fragrance for 10 days. Such extraordinary signs, a reversal of the stench and decay that usually accompany death, signal that the deceased has escaped diluted rebirth and reached the pure land. The third and most widely reported index to a person's ojo was the revelatory dream, appearing to teachers, fellow practitioners, relatives, or friends of the deceased. For example, shortly after the death of the monk Ninkei, the monk who had attended him in his last hours dreamed that 5 colored clouds rose over the capital, while music and unusual fragrance filled the air. A lotus pedestal descended from the clouds, and Ninkei seated himself upon it, ascended, and vanished toward the west. Dreams such as this one, whose contents suggested that Amida's welcoming descent had actually occurred, were especially valued. And if similar dreams appeared to more than one person, all the more proof of that deceased person's attainment. As the most private of signs, appropriate dreams could sometimes be produced when needed. When a death fell short of the ideal, for example, when someone lapsed into coma or delirium and died without chanting the final nembutsu, an auspicious dream could relieve fears about that person's post-mortem state. The identification of signs was no mere literary convention. Men and women of pre-modern Japan actively sought for and identified signs confirming the ojo of the deceased, and often made note of them in diaries and family genealogies. Dreams and visions reported by the dying and by those left behind, and their literary and artistic representations in ojo-den and paintings of Amida's welcoming descent, probably stood in a circular relationship. Reports of deathbed visions and the dreams of survivors would have informed the paintings, the accounts, the representations, and the representations in turn shaped the dreams and visions. People saw or dreamt what they knew one was supposed to see. In this way, ojo as a social fact was determined by one's survivors, and the judgment often rested on the manner of one's death and accompanying signs. Ojo-den spread the hopeful message that birth in the Pure Land was open to anyone who could meet death with a properly focused mind. Most of their subjects are virtuous and devout, but these collections also contain scattered accounts of persons who, owing to circumstances, were unable to undertake demanding practices or keep the Buddhist moral precepts. The lowly monk Jacqueline is born a servant. Constantly at the beck and call of others, he cannot act freely and knows almost nothing about the Buddhist teachings. His only religious act in life is to carve a small Buddha image. He also gladly gives away his food to anyone who asks. Yet he dies in ideal fashion, chanting the Nembutsu. Other examples concern the Ojo of evildoers. The emblematic evil men in Ojo-den collections are those who take life: hunters, fishermen, and especially warriors, men emerging as a powerful force within medieval society, but whose professional obligation to engage in killing of animals in the hunt as a form of war training and of men on the battlefield was seen from a Buddhist ethical standpoint as sinful. One account tells of a certain Tamba no Taifu, a warrior who hunts for pleasure and exacts harsh tribute from the peasants on his estates. His atrocities are too many to record, but in later life, he repents his evils and dies calmly, chanting Amida's name. The compiler remarks, "Surely this shows that even those who commit the 10 evils and 5 perverse offenses can be born in the Pure Land by the power of their last Nembutsu." And here, in this 14th century narrative scroll, we see a warrior who has managed to chant one final Nembutsu even as he's cut down in battle. You can see him here, and you can see the light of Amida coming to receive him in the middle of the fighting. Such examples echo the message of the Visualization Sutra that the Pure Land is open to anyone, even the sinful who can meet death with a mind fixed reverently on the Buddha. This notion of life's last moment as a unique window of liberative opportunity was on one hand hopeful. It was linked to and helped promote popular doctrines of universal salvation, especially for those unable to uphold the precepts or engage in strict religious disciplines. Yet it had a dark side. Precisely because the last moment was seen as volatile, it was also deemed dangerous. That is, even for a devout Buddhist, a single stray doubt or distracted thought at the last moment could in effect negate a lifetime's worth of virtuous practice and send that person plummeting down into the evil paths. Increasingly, postmortem possibilities were understood as a binary either-or of birth in the Pure Land or descent into the lower realms. Tanshu, the first Japanese scholar monk after Genshin to write about deathbed practice, warns that since good or evil recompense in the next life is determined by one's thought at the last moment, those who miss this opportunity are very close to hell. And the evil rebirth realms were no abstract, vague idea, but were depicted in lovingly gruesome detail in Buddhist paintings of the period, and as in this image of people tormented in a river of fire in the hells, or struggling in a lake of burning excrement where they are attacked by hard-snouted maggots that suck the marrow from their bones. Dante had nothing on the Buddhist hills. Or they might be reborn as hungry ghosts feeding in a cesspool, so tormented by starvation that they will quite literally eat anything. Anxieties about the last moment were expressed and exacerbated by edifying tales that circulated about the dangers of stray thoughts at the last moment. The 12th century collection, Tales from Times Past, Konjaku Monogatari, tells of an extraordinarily devout monk who for many years recites the Nembutsu with an earnest prayer for rebirth in Amida's Pure Land. Impressed by his piety, everyone says that he's certain to achieve Ojo. But then, on his deathbed, even while chanting his final Nembutsu, he happens to notice a vinegar jar on the shelf in the room. And he thinks, I wonder who'll take that when I'm gone. Just as this thought occurs to him, he dies. And because of this slight vestige of attachment at the last moment, he is reborn as a small snake inside the vinegar jar. One's manner of death was not purely an individual affair, but also affected one's associates. Survivors might experience a crisis of interpretation when the deceased person's reputation for virtue and piety was not reflected in the manner of their death. For a prominent cleric or teacher, a bad death could call into question his spiritual attainments or the legitimacy of his teaching. A 14th century essay on poetics, Nomori no Kagami, mocks the death of Ippen, founder of a new religious order. Ippen's followers, it says, had predicted that when he died, purple clouds would rise and lotus blossoms would fall from the skies. But when the time actually came, there was no sign of Amida's descent, and Ippen's body was in so hideous a state that his disciples had to hurry to cremate him before others could see it. This problem was by no means confined to monastic circles. The monk Muju, writing in the 13th century, laments that many people are ashamed to reveal the bad death of a parent, teacher, or disciple, and instead report that it went well, implying that the deceased had reached the Pure Land. This is not a good thing to do, he warns. When somebody dies badly, you should relate it just as it happened and earnestly pray for that person's enlightenment, praying with compassion even for those dead to whom you have no personal connection. That is what will save the deceased. Ample evidence survives of widespread concern that whether due to insufficient training in practice or to a lack of merit, one might not be able to focus one's mind appropriately when death overtook one. If one's inner state of mind indeed was reflected in the manner of one's dying, then death became a kind of performance in which one had to be concerned not only about its impact on one's own post-mortem fate, but also about how it would affect others. Ultimately, the ideal of mindful death embodied both boundless possibilities for liberation, but also grave dangers. And it generated contradictory responses of simultaneous hope and fear. Anxieties on this score occasioned two broad types of attempts to exercise some degree of control over the unique potential of the liminal final moment. One is related to the logic of personal effort that I mentioned at the beginning and involves striving to build up sufficient momentum of virtue through religious practice during one's lifetime to predispose one to right thoughts at the end. Desire for a good death helped drive a quantitative approach to merit-making that appears from around the 11th century. The courtier Miyoshi no Tameyasu, himself the compiler of two Ojoden collections, offers a striking example. From the time he turned 60, Tameyasu recited the Heart Sutra, a short Buddhist text, 300 times a day to prevent the possibility of demonic obstructions at the time of his death. And from age 72, as his daily practice, he not only chanted the Heart Sutra 300 times, but also recited the Nembutsu 10,000 times, the Amida Sutra 9 times, the Daimon Sutra 3 times, the greater wish-fulfilling Kannon spell 1,000 times, and he continued these disciplines for another 11 years up until his death, even though for much of that time he was still engaged in official court duties. Such examples occur frequently in courtier diaries and Ojoden collections. For example, the nun Myoho, for 42 years, each day recited the Amida Sutra 6 times, 4 chapters of the Lotus Sutra and 1 chapter of the Benevolent King Sutra, 1 time each, the Kannon Sutra 10 times, and the Nembutsu 10,000 times, counting the number of her Nembutsu recitations with small beans. And we read many accounts of people just accumulating bushels of small beans, counting their Nembutsu chanting over the years. All such efforts were geared ultimately to the final moment, in the hope that virtue accumulated in this life would enable one to meet one's end with a calm and focused mind. However, once efforts for achieving Ojo were framed in terms of quantity, one could never do enough. The ideal of right mindfulness at the time of death thus encouraged unremitting efforts in merit accumulation, while at the same time undermining any certainty that such efforts would ultimately be efficacious. This uncertainty helped to promote a second strategy of control, to seek the help of a religious guide, termed a Zenshishiki, in Sanskrit, Kalyana Mitra, or good friend. While this term refers more generally to a Buddhist teacher or companion in practice, the Zenshishiki in this context means an attendant at the deathbed, usually, although not always, a monastic. Instructions for deathbed practice, written from the 11th century on, increasingly stressed the role and duties of this person. He, and it was usually a he, is responsible for the layout of the death chamber, especially the positioning of the Buddha image and the offerings of lamps and incense. He may serve as preceptor and perform a deathbed ordination for the dying person. He may also act as nurse, attending to the dying person's physical needs. The Zenshishiki must continually gauge the dying person's mental state and preach accordingly, exhorting the dying person in a proper attitude, such as shunning this defiled world and aspiring to the Pure Land, or urging them to maintain their mental focus in spite of physical pain. The Zenshishiki must monitor and interpret the dying person's visions. If demonic hindrances manifest, he must act as exorcist. Demonic entities, it was thought, could even mimic the appearance of the Buddha to lure the dying into their clutches, and the Zenshishiki had to know how to recognize and dispel them. All the while, he must lead the deathbed chanting, maintaining its pace, pitch, and rhythm. He must correctly discern the approach of the end and announce to the dying person, "Now is your last moment, Tadaima Rinju." And if at all possible, he must induce the dying person to chant the final 10 Nembutsu. Manuals for deathbed practice compiled after Genshin's original instructions reflect a cumulative, hands-on experience with the sick and dying. One such manual, by the late 13th century monk Ryochu, is especially detailed on the subject of nursing. Ryochu recommends that a schedule of watches be set up and measured by burning incense, so that multiple Zenshishiki may relieve one another. At night, lamps should be lit so that the dying person can see the Buddha image, and so that the Zenshishiki can clearly observe the dying person, for illness often worsens at night. The dying should not be forced to get up to urinate or defecate if unable to do so. In such cases, screens should be set up between the dying person and the Buddha image while the bedding is being changed. However, if death is imminent, such concerns may be set aside. Ryochu also advises on how to deal with fractious and recalcitrant patients, and with demands for inappropriate food, such as fish. One should never ask the dying, "Would you like anything?" as it can arouse desire and distract their thoughts from the Buddha. Surviving pre-modern instructions for deathbed practice unanimously condemn resort to life-prolonging rites as encouraging attachment to this flawed world. They disagree, however, about the use of medicine for pain relief. Such treatment could alleviate suffering, thus enabling better concentration on the Buddha. But that also carried the danger of clouding the mind and instead hindering the dying person's mental focus. Later deathbed manuals frankly acknowledge, as Genshin's original instructions did not, that many people lapse into unconsciousness before dying. Several recommend that the Zenshishiki are to observe the dying person's breathing carefully and match their breathing to his, chanting the Nembutsu in unison on the out-breath. Should the dying person become mentally confused or fall unconscious, responsibility for the deathbed chanting shifts immediately to the deathbed attendant, who can save that person by the power of their own Nembutsu. Even after the breath has ceased, deathbed attendants should continue chanting for several hours. Although the consciousness of the deceased may be wandering in the interim state, that person can still be led to the Pure Land simply by hearing the Zenshishiki's chanting. Here, the logic of deathbed practice, intended to awaken right mindfulness in the dying, shades off into the funerary logic of merit transfer rites for the deceased. In this way, the Zenshishiki increasingly assumed the status of a deathbed specialist. In instructions for deathbed practice, it is often he, even more than the dying person, who is represented as ultimately responsible for that person's success or failure in reaching the Pure Land. Let's look at two images showing Zenshishiki, both from a 14th century narrative scroll. And here we see an aristocratic nun. She's sitting upright in the posture of meditation. You can see the clouds, colored clouds, indicating Amida's descent and his light coming for her. Here is her Zenshishiki, a nun who is striking a gong to keep the pace of the chanting, and her ladies in waiting are attending and chanting in support. And here, from the same narrative scroll, we see the teacher Honen over here acting as Zenshishiki to the monk Ensho, who is sitting upright before a hanging picture of Amida. Again, you can see the Buddha's light coming to receive him. At this point in the narrative, Ensho has chanted the name of Amida 9 times, and his teacher Honen over here is going, once more, once more. Who were the Zenshishiki? For the most part, adepts, clerics who regularly took part in this task came from among semi-reclusive, ascetically inclined figures, often monks without positions in the clerical hierarchy and practicing outside formal temple structures. Clerics with high ranks in the temple hierarchy or official appointments, those who routinely performed rituals for things like state protection, or that invoked, who performed rites invoking the local deities or kami, had to observe strict standards of ritual purity, so they could not routinely attend deathbeds. Contact with death was deemed defiling and required a 30-day period of purification. In contrast, although they often maintained loose ties to temples and performed a range of ritual services for lay patrons, semi-reclusive monks occupied a social space apart from both lay and formal clerical worlds. Ordinary distinctions of pure and defiled did not apply to them. Their outside status seemed to represent the ascetic ideal of world rejection, said to be a prerequisite for a Pure Land birth, and enabled them to mediate the pollution of death. Their emergence as deathbed ritual specialists marks a little-known chapter in the story of how Buddhism in Japan gained dominance over death management. And by the way, if anybody is really interested in this and wants to know more about pre-modern death practices in Japan, there just happens to be a book on that subject. As we've seen, the concept of right mindfulness at death that I've addressed this evening engendered both hopes and anxieties for the life to come. The manner of a person's death was not only held to exert a decisive influence on that person's post-mortem fate, but also constituted a social fact that influenced survivors. The efforts of those medieval practitioners who sought to die with their thoughts focused on the Pure Land reflect an inevitable tension between religious ideals and the actual circumstances of dying, and so offer a revealing window onto the lived Buddhism of Japan's pre-modern period. Today, when concepts of the afterlife have lost their firm hold on the religious imagination, deathbed rites have all but disappeared in Japan, and traditional funerals, too, are becoming increasingly truncated and are in decline. But for pre-modern people who aspired to a Pure Land birth that could only be realized through the mediation of death, it was important to die well. With this, I'll conclude my talk, and after the break, I welcome your questions and comments. Thank you very much for your attention.